because they need to be managed, they need to be updated, and the threat landscape changes all the time. So it's good to have you can't just buy a router and stick it in place and say, oh, I'm good. It should be supported, and it should be from a reputable vendor, and it needs to be managed and configured. The configuration of a router is really, really important, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Software security updates, these are really crucial. Many of the updates that are released for operating systems, whether it's Windows most commonly in use, or whether it's Mac OS or even Linux or anything else, a lot of the updates are security related. And it's important to keep them up to date. It can be a pain to manage them, and that's one of the things as an IT provider that we spend a lot of time on is taking a look at the updates, figuring out which ones do what, and testing them and managing those updates for our customers. But it's really important to keep everyone protected. User training is incredibly crucial. We'll talk about this as we go along here. But your users are your best defense and your worst weakness at the same time. And if they're not properly trained on how to handle email and internet access and even phone calls and information within the company, then you're going to have a problem. So it's really important to have some kind of a regular training program in place to keep your users up to date on what to look for. Yes? Right.
So how does that affect, so then do I have to worry about more my home computer, or is the security kind of taken care of?
It's both. That's a really good question, because that's coming into play much more. People work from home a lot, and so if you're using your home computer to access a remote work network, there's two things that need to happen. Some of that is network security and not physical security. You should make sure your computer that you're using is physically secure, and if you're doing that, you shouldn't save login passwords and those types of things on that computer, because if it does get stolen from your home and you've got those passwords and things saved, somebody could just use those to remote into your work network, and then you've got a breach. So it's a little bit of both, and none of these security measures work apart from the others. You can't choose to focus on one and ignore the others. You need to do all of these. Viruses, malware, ransomware, you see these in the news all the time, and they're not going away, especially now that a lot of this stuff is state-sponsored and used to fund terrorism and all sorts of other things. And the protection for these is obviously antivirus software. And we'll talk about that more thoroughly in a few minutes. But firewalls as well. Firewalls can prevent some of these issues from occurring. And email security software and hardware. If you've got a larger organization, you may have an appliance that actually scans your email in addition to the software scanning the email and stripping some of these threats out ahead of time. Again, software security updates come into play here because as threats emerge, updates are released to prevent them from taking hold. And user training, again, is important. Knowing, and we will talk about that more. Backups. Backups are important. If you have malware deployed on a system or ransomware deployed on a system, you've got a real potential for data loss, and unless you have a backup, you're not going to get it back. So we don't want to talk about just keeping the bad guys from getting your data. We want to prevent you from losing your data as well. What about lost or stolen systems and the data on those? How do we prevent those? One is company policies. Like don't save passwords locally. Where should you keep your laptop? How do you keep it locked up? Password policies. I think you were mentioning that about changing password frequently, and you can make that a company policy and implement it through server management and require that passwords be changed on a regular basis, require a certain length of password, certain complexity. All of these types of things help with that. Multi-factor authentication, particularly for mobile devices. Mobile devices are becoming more commonly used. People are on their phones all the time, and I use mine like a mobile office. Where would we be without our smartphones? And sometimes they're too smart, and they have too much information on them. So, does everybody know what multi-factor authentication is? Multi-factor authentication, rather than just having a password that can be easily stolen or guessed or hacked, it requires a second type of authentication, and there's a few different forms of those. You've probably been to websites where they require you to be texted a number. So you put in your password, and then they text you a code, and then you have to put in that code, and then you get in. Well, that's multi-factor authentication. Just a password isn't good enough. You need to have that device with you as well, and it's much more secure. Nobody in North Korea is going to have your cell phone to get that second code. There's also authentication apps that you can use. Google has one, Microsoft has one that do an encrypted code on a regular basis, and there's biometrics and a whole host of other options for multi-factor authentication. It seriously makes things more secure. Whole device encryption is really important for mobile devices in particular, but also for if you're working with the government, it may be required for certain workstations and computers. And that basically takes all of your data and encrypts it so that even if it's stolen and somebody is able to pull out the hard drive and put it in another computer, unless they have your login information, your username and password, they can't get into it and read any of that data. It's all just a bunch of gibberish. And so that's a way to protect data. And once again, user training. It's critical in every area, and backups. How do you recover lost data? You restore it from a backup, provided that you have one. Any questions? We won't spend much time on this because this isn't common, especially in small businesses, but the dedicated denial of service attack, the way to get around these, where a whole host of computers is saturating your internet network with a bunch of traffic trying to shut you down or shut your website down. The way to deal with that is with routers and the way they're configured, with firewalls and the way that they're configured, and with redundant network configurations so that you don't just have one route to the network or some sort of distributed network configuration. Again, not a very common problem, but I did want to mention it. How do we deal with our employees and the network security? This is one of the most important areas, and it's one of the most neglected. We hire people, we trust them, and sometimes we shouldn't trust them. But even if they are trustworthy, people make mistakes, except for me. We all make mistakes all the time, and so if we can help our employees not make mistakes, it makes their jobs a lot easier. And the way to do this is through network access controls, which are very important. If an employee does not need access to a certain piece of information, they shouldn't be able to get access to a certain piece of information on the network. So often I go to a company and it's just a free-for-all. All the data is shared, everybody has access to all of the information, and it's understandable because that's a lot easier to manage. You don't have to worry about giving this person access and that person access, but it's also a problem. It's just inviting trouble. Even if an employee isn't stealing anything or doing anything wrong, It opens up the possibility that they might accidentally overwrite an important file or delete an important file, or if they do get some malware or a virus, then everybody's files are going to get encrypted. It's a problem. So network access controls need to be implemented, and they need to be on as restrictive a basis as possible. It should always be done. Everything is locked down, and then things are only opened up as needs emerge. That's the best way to do that. Company policies, we talked about this already. Password policies, data integrity policies, and all of these things on phone policies, information that should be given out over the phone. What should you say? What shouldn't you say? And how to deal with emails. Training. Training is really important for our employees. They need to know how to do their work, and it should be a regular training program. They should be updated. It's not an orientation where they're given a day's worth of training and sat at their computer, said, okay, have fun. There should be a regular training program implemented so that they can be continually updated on how to do their job. And again, backups. People make mistakes. It happens to our clients on a fairly regular basis. Somebody saved over a file when they meant to save a copy of it, or they deleted a folder that they didn't mean to, or they lost something, and backups are a good way to recover any of that information. Questions? All righty. So let's take a look at some of these key components that we've already discussed briefly. The first one is our antivirus. What should we look for when we want to implement an antivirus solution? One of the key things in a business is to have some sort of centralized management. There's a whole host of good antivirus software solutions out there, and I'm not here to sell any particular one. But if you were going to implement an antivirus solution in your business, you want to make sure that you're taking the form, and all of the big guys have business-oriented solutions with centralized management. It's a real pain and not very effective to just install a consumer antivirus program on each specific workstation or computer, because you don't know that your users are getting viruses. You don't know that they're not shutting the antivirus off. You have no way to make sure that the updates are happening regularly. So a business solution should have some kind of a centralized management so that you can tell when you can be alerted when viruses are breaking out or a computer is infected. You can prevent users from turning the antivirus off or removing the antivirus, and you can manage the updates. It's really important. You should also make sure that you have protection for all devices, not just the desktops, not just the laptops, not just the server, but all of them. It's like herd immunity for for vaccines. You want to make sure everything is protected, and even mobile devices, phones, tablets, those types of things should be protected as well. They need to protect the internet connection, browsing, email, and files. And they should include some form of heuristic detection. Now, heuristic detection is a fancy word for being able to detect viruses that are unknown. Viruses usually exhibit some pattern of behavior, and a good antivirus program is going to not just look for known viruses, but it's going to look for that behavior pattern, and it's going to tag new viruses before they even have updates for it, because viruses are produced at such a rapid rate and changed at a rapid rate, the antivirus companies can't even keep up with them. So that's an important thing. And frequent updates. The antivirus signatures should be updated very frequently in order to stay on top of the latest threats. User training. I view this as one of the most important elements of a cybersecurity protection plan, because, like we said before, your your employees and your users